China has recently released a new education policy that, where implemented, will ban foreigners located outside of China from teaching English online to young learners within China. Hi, this is Alex from Ninja Teacher, and let's get into the specifics of this policy. So I want to cover why the policy, why China decided to implement this, and what exactly they're trying to achieve with it. Then talk about how this is actually going to affect online English teachers, as well as what we've seen so far in the implementation of it. And then finally talk about what some alternatives and options are moving forward for those of you that may be affected by this. So what is the policy and why is China implementing it? Well, if you read the official policy on the Ministry of Education website, you'll see that it's quite a sweeping policy and it has over 30 points within it. And only some of those are actually directly affecting online English teachers, and I'll go through that more specifically, but it is a big education reform policy. So there's a lot in it and you can check it out yourself if you're interested, but the points that really stand out and that are relevant is that China seems to be wanting to reduce the educational burden on students, and that's going to involve reducing the amount of homework and the after-school training that they have outside of their regular curriculum, as well as improving the actual Chinese curriculum so that the education they get with the state-funded education is better. The stated reasons for wanting to do this is to reduce the financial burden on parents that are paying a lot of money for children to go to extra tutoring and schooling outside of the normal school hours, and also because there's a really low birth rate in China, so they want to hopefully get people to have more children, and that would involve making the cost of education lower, because at the moment there is a lot of competitiveness and parents spend a lot of money on their children to try to get them into good universities and do well in final exams in school. So it is expensive to do that. So parents are having less children because of that. Also, there's a lot of academic pressure on these students and they are doing a lot of work outside of the normal school hours, and I think anyone who's lived in Asia or taught online to Asian students know that there's a lot of extra work they're expected to do, and there's tons of pressure on these kids. There may also be other unstated reasons for this, and if you've been paying attention, China has cracked down a lot on the private market in China. A lot of high-tech companies have had some kind of policies against them in the last year or two. So the government could be trying to get more control over the private capital in China. And also reading through the policy, there's quite a bit about foreign material that's not part of the Chinese syllabus being taught by these education companies. So that could also be part of it, wanting to have more control over the education in China. Anyway, regardless of the reasons, the policy has been put in place. So let's go through specifically the points in the policy that may affect English teachers and the ESL market in general. So one of the biggest points is that private education companies can no longer be for-profit companies. They have to register as non-profits. They can't raise capital, they can't get investment from outside of China, and they can't go public on the stock exchange. So this was a huge deal because there are lots of private education companies in China, and especially the big ones have been affected by this. So the ones that are publicly listed on the stock exchange have seen huge crashes in their stock. It's worth noting though that most of these publicly listed companies are more tutoring and test prep companies. Some do have online ESL teaching divisions, but these aren't the majority of the online teaching companies. Most of the big online English teaching companies do have big amounts of investment, but they're not publicly traded. Regardless, these online ESL companies, the big ones, the smaller ones, they can no longer be listed as private companies apparently and have to switch to non-profit. So that means they can't get any more investments, they can't list as a public company and get a return on investment for all those investors. So if you're familiar with tech companies, it's kind of like Silicon Valley, right? They grow as fast as they can and then they sell or they go public. That's how these fast growth startups make money, and a lot of them in China right now are these kinds of companies. So it seems as though these will be the companies that are most under scrutiny with this new policy, And there may be some differences with the smaller companies and the English centers, but I'll talk more about that in the implementation of this policy section next. Now, the ban of these companies is specifically for subject tutoring companies, so like maths and science and English. So it did seem like there was a possibility that these conversational online teaching platforms wouldn't be affected, but it does seem like there is, to at least a certain degree, a lot of these companies being affected by this. Although when it comes to implementation, we may see some companies classifying themselves as different kinds of education, which may be a way to get around this. And also to clarify, most of these policies are with regard to young learners, so school students. So here are a few of the other points that may affect you as an English teacher. There's no after-hours tutoring or teaching allowed after 9 p.m. and on weekends and on public holidays, which is actually when a lot of that happened. No teaching online whatsoever to children below 6 years of age. No teaching of foreign curriculum allowed. And then possibly the most important and biggest one is no foreigners located outside of China are allowed to teach young learners within China. So obviously that means teaching English online to online learners. And it did say specifically hiring of foreigners abroad. And I was wondering if this would actually be a way to get around it, because a lot of English teachers who are hired by these companies are independent contractors and are not technically hired as full-time staff members. So I wasn't sure if that would affect them. And it does seem like it has to a certain degree, although that is something to consider maybe moving forward. It may be kind of a loophole around that in the future. Okay, so let's talk about the implementation of this policy so far, what we've seen happen, and how this might directly affect you as an online English teacher. There's a lot that we don't know, and we don't know how all these things are going to play out, so just bear that in mind. But there have been some immediate effects, and we have seen some immediate repercussions of this in the online teaching industry. So some of these online English teaching companies have reacted in different ways. So the first one that we've seen is some have just decided to immediately shut down. And there have been a few of these. I've seen a few announcements, official announcements from companies themselves and from teachers saying that their companies are shutting down. And that was with immediate effect for some of them. So quite a few people just got the news and then they basically lost their jobs, which is really unfortunate. One of the big ones, GoGoKid, was a subsidy of a big investment company in China. So I think they just saw the signs and they just decided to cut it. And that is also something to be aware of, is that different companies have different motivations for making their decisions. Some might just be like, okay, we don't see this upward struggle of keeping the company going worth it, so we're just gonna do away with that product because we have all these other offers that we still have. So, there's no need to focus on something that's going to be really difficult to do. And then I think on the other end of the spectrum, there's just some of these small startup companies that were just like, okay, we haven't got that far into our business and we're also just, not going to do anything about it. We're just going to close. Then there are a few companies that have announced that they do plan to close as soon as students have finished out their lessons that they've paid for. So a few companies like this, Magic Ears is quite a big company that announced this, but they did say that they expect to have students for at least another 6 months to 12 months, and a lot of teachers will have that period of time to still get classes, still work for the company, and then find alternative work. And then lastly, there's those companies that are well established and that plan to pivot and keep going in one way or another. A big example of this would be VIP Kid, who have announced that they plan to stay in business. They are trying, at least they say this publicly, to keep all their teachers on board and keep the teachers that they have already. Although, to be honest, it's going to be very difficult with, I don't know, maybe 90% of their target market being young learners in China to actually keep going. But they did say that they've been launching new products over the years, or over the last year. I think they probably saw the signs that this might be happening soon and are trying to sell products in different countries, so find students outside of China. These companies have multiple entities. They're set up in different countries. So, while their China one might not be able to operate as a for-profit company anymore, they might have offices in another country where they could, direct most of their revenue to. Who knows? So I'm kind of speculating on this here, but I did see them say specifically in an announcement that they have been launching new products and are trying to keep their teachers on board. So, this is the kind of thing that I think we're going to see more of, is companies trying to adapt to these new policies in one way or another. But it does really seem like teaching English, at least to young learners in China, online as an English teacher while you're abroad is quite affected. You know, we can't know for sure if things are going to change at all, but right now, unfortunately, a lot of people probably are going to be affected. And that market of young learners in China is a really big one within the ESL industry. So that really is the most unfortunate thing. And it's kind of sad to see because, you know, I've been in this industry for over 7 years now, and I really have seen how young learners of English being exposed to native English speakers or those fluent in English from other countries has a huge effect on their ability to learn and speak English fluently. So it's really kind of sad to see that children are not going to have this exposure, at least through these online companies. And we'll see how the situation progresses. And for anyone and everyone that might have lost a job right now, it really does suck because obviously a lot of people are relying on an income from online sources right now, and this has been a big one for a lot of people. So it's really unfortunate to see, especially with lockdowns around Asia at the moment, that people that were relying on it, online income might be affected by this. Okay, so let's talk about some of your options now and alternatives if you are an online English teacher or you plan to do it in the future. And I also want to give you a little bit of perspective. I was teaching English online for a little bit back in 2015 when I first moved to Vietnam. And back then it was a real mess. It was like clunky software. The connections were bad, the software just was terrible, you know, people wouldn't be able to mute themselves or unmute themselves, there was like very bad video quality. So just to think about how far it's come since then, in the last few years the online English learning and teaching industry really grew, and obviously in 2020 it skyrocketed. And like I mentioned, fast-paced startups are always going to be trying to grow as fast and as quickly as possible, and might have grown a little bit too fast and too quickly. As a lot of people who taught online know, there were some issues with working for these Chinese companies, but it's important to note that many of these companies didn't even exist a few years ago. So while yes, they were the market leaders, this is where a lot of the jobs were, we've seen this shift over to online learning, and that's not going to go away at all. For one, we've just reached this point where online learning is here to stay. And also the English learning market has been around for decades, and that's also not going away. There are over 1 billion English learners in the world, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So yes, this is having a direct effect on the industry right now. Yes, it has significant impacts, but it's also important to have a little bit of perspective about where things might go. So let's talk about some of the options for you right now, and also how things might move in a direction in the future, and some things you might want to consider about alternatives. So the first thing to note is this affects companies based in China. Now, just because the Chinese government implemented this policy and doesn't want Chinese parents to spend all their money on education for their children, it's a huge deal in China. People want to invest in their children's education, they want to give them the best start, it's very competitive. And just because the government says you shouldn't be spending money on it doesn't mean the parents agree and are necessarily going to listen. So obviously that raises the question of companies outside of China marketing to parents within China. Now there's things to consider, like will they have access, will they be able to make payments to these companies outside of China? There are things like VPNs that could make this more possible. So there are things to consider, but you know, where there's a will, there's a way. So if there's a demand, there's a supply as well. So whether this is companies outside of China or even companies within China that are kind of figuring out ways to keep on going, I think there's still going to be a demand, which means there's still going to be a supply, and we're going to have to see how that pans out and see what comes up. But it may be the case that a lot of online teaching platforms outside of China will see Chinese students coming onto them. The second one is teaching to adults. So right now it seems like most of the online teaching companies based in China catering to adults still allow you to teach to adults. So we may see a lot of these online companies switch to teaching to adults, or you know, the ones that are already established as teaching to adults, they will probably continue. And then there's teaching English in person, and here at Ninja Teacher, you know, that's actually been our primary focus over the last few years. Most of the 1,000+ people we've helped get jobs have been in-person jobs, and a lot of people have taught English on the side, or you know, maybe they've wanted to travel a bit more and they've switched to online teaching. But in-person teaching jobs are a lot more stable in a lot of ways. You have proper contract, you can get work visas in that country. Right now, a lot of these in-person jobs in countries throughout Asia and other countries as well are not in person at the moment. So a lot of these schools are still hiring, but then you'll teach online for them. So then you'll be hired by an English center, and a lot of your teaching might be online for a while actually. A lot of these companies have switched to fully online, but have plans to go back to in-person. So you can teach English online essentially, but you'd be employed by an in-person center, and then you'd probably switch to in-person teaching at the time when it is more possible. And if you've been following the news, we're in a pretty strict lockdown here in Vietnam right now. So that means there's 100 million people stuck indoors, and there's opportunities to teach online. We might see more online English teaching companies that are specifically focused on online teaching pop up in countries like Vietnam, which would mean more opportunities for jobs. So that brings me to the next point of finding online ESL companies that are based outside of China that have non-Chinese students as well. And there are quite a lot of these too, so you can do some research. You know, there's lists all over the internet about these companies. And of course, more and more of these companies are going to exist over time. Then some people have suggested find your own students, doing tutoring online, starting your own business essentially. I would be a little bit wary of this because starting a business is very difficult and a risk. Marketing is difficult and expensive, so that would be the hardest part, is actually finding students. And a lot of complaints people had of online teaching companies is they didn't get enough hours. Now imagine you had to go and find all your own students yourself. I'm not saying don't do it, but it is significantly easier to get a job than it is to start a business. I would highly recommend against this if you don't have a steady stream of income and have capital and have enough money to survive on. Don't think this is a quick and easy way to start making some money. If that's the case and you have the extra time, you know, go ahead if you like. I would recommend investing in your skills. If you do want to optimize your chances of getting a job, I think now schools might be more picky with teachers, so what you should really work on is your presentation in demo classes. Really focus on presenting well, getting a good setup with good lighting, because a lot of these companies, when they hire you, they're going to be looking at your presentation skills, your actual teaching ability if they get you to do a demo class. So just focus on that if you are looking to get a job. I think that's how you can probably stand out the most right now. And then the last one I want to mention, which might be a good middle ground between just being a full-time employee and then starting your own business, is these kind of online teaching marketplaces where you would actually have to put some effort into building up your own profile. You can maybe set your own rates. You might have to post content, and there's probably going to be competition to get chosen over other teachers, but these platforms have students coming to them, so that means you can actually just focus on being the best teacher you can be, you know, marketing yourself within that platform, but you don't have to find the actual students. And then obviously they're going to take some kind of a cut. This could be a good middle ground if you want to be a little bit more independent, but also want a good middle ground where you don't have to go out and find students yourself. What do you think are the best options for moving forward right now? Leave a comment below. And if you want to watch a video about what the online teaching lifestyle can be like when restrictions are more lifted, check out this video over here. And I'll speak to you soon in a new video. Peace.